Change is inevitable. Mutation is universal. It's bound to happen. There's so many opportunities for errors to occur along the way that variation will exist in all things, including species, cells, organisms. Genetic variation makes evolution possible. When that change is inherited, the accumulation of differences in genes or DNA segments can serve as the groundwork, the prerequisite for natural selection. Whether or not that variation is heritable is chance. Did the mutation occur in germline cells? Did the mutation occur in sperm or egg gametes? And did those particular sperm and eggs combine? Genetic variation can come about in a number of ways. New genes and allele forms can arise by single nucleotide mutations, but only those that occur in gametes will be passed on to offspring. These mutations can be point mutations, a single letter that change, and the outcome of these mutations can be harmless, silent, or provide an advantage or disadvantage. Mutation just means different. It is ultimately the functionality and the environment that will determine whether or not it's suited. New genes and alleles can also arise through chromosomal mutations. Polyploidy, altering of the chromosome number, changes such as translocation, inversion, or deletions. With chromosomal mutations, large changes are generally harmful, but small segments of duplication or deletion may be less harmful, may lead to new functions. The example here is dog snout length. It varies based upon how many copies of a particular gene was inherited. The longer the snout, the more copies they have. The shorter the snout, the less. Too short can be harmful. We know that pugs and Boston Terriers, French bulldogs have trouble breathing, but on the whole, just different. Genetic variation can also come about through sex. Meiosis can shuffle existing alleles into new combinations through crossover events. And the actual act of sex combines one sperm to one egg. This is a 1 in 1.2 billion unique possibility of variations. So if change is inevitable, how do we know when a population is merely different or actively evolving? There's a mathematical equation for this, known as the Hardy-Weinberg equation. The frequency of an allele in a population can be calculated based upon who exhibits that trait. And we assume that if it's an equilibrium, the sum of all possibilities will equal 1. Be able to recognize this equation and what it represents. P squared is the frequency or proportion of the population that is doubly dominant. Q squared is the proportion of the population that is doubly recessive. And 2PQ represents the two ways you could inherit a dominant trait and a recessive trait. Because we're taking into consideration homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive, the 3 possible outcomes of a Punnett cross, the frequency should equal 1. Anytime it does not equal 1, we're seeing evidence of evolution, change within the population. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is a situation in which the variation will remain constant from one generation to the next. The population is not evolving. These are maintenance inheritance patterns, preserving known and working genes and phenotypes time and time again. So we're looking at this beetle generation. We can see the genotypes and the frequency for generation 1. 36% will be doubly dominant, 48% will be heterozygous, 16% will be doubly recessive. And if we cross them and cross them and cross them and cross them and cross them, and we continue to see 36% doubly dominant, 48% heterozygous, and 16% doubly recessive, and all of those things equal 1, we've got proof of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. This leads us to the Hardy-Weinberg principle of equilibrium, which assumes that in order for this mathematical equation to hold true, there must be no mutations. There must be random mating. Nobody's going to avoid somebody with a bad gene. That there is no natural selection. All traits are good and healthy and viable. There's a large population, and no new genes are coming into the equation. Just rattling off this list, you can see that that's highly unlikely to occur in nature, which tells us that evolutionary change is happening often. We just have to be able to recognize it in action.
The 5 Fingers of Evolution. A thorough understanding of biology requires a thorough understanding of the process of evolution. Most people are familiar with the process of natural selection. However, this is just one of 5 processes that can result in evolution. Before we discuss all 5 of these processes, we should define evolution. Evolution is simply change in the gene pool over time. But what is a gene pool? And for that matter, what is a gene? Before spending any more time on genetics, let us begin with a story. Imagine that a boat capsizes and 10 survivors swim to shore on a deserted island. They are never rescued and they form a new population that exists for thousands of years. Strangely enough, 5 of the survivors have red hair. Red hair is created when a person inherits 2 copies of the red gene from their parents. If you only have 1 copy of the gene, you won't have red hair. To make this easier, we will assume that the 5 non-redheads are not carriers of the gene. The initial frequency of the red hair gene is therefore 50%, or 10 of 20 total genes. These genes are the gene pool. The 20 different genes are like cards in a deck that keep getting reshuffled with each new generation. Sex is simply a reshuffling of the genetic deck. The cards are reshuffled and passed to the next generation. The deck remains the same, 50% red. The genes are reshuffled and passed to the next generation. The gene pool remains the same, 50% red. Even though the population may grow in size over time, the frequency should stay at about 50%. If this frequency ever varies, then evolution has occurred. Evolution is simply change in the gene pool over time. Think about it in terms of the cards. If the frequency of the cards in the deck ever changes, evolution has occurred. There are 5 processes that can cause the frequency to change. To remember these processes, we will use the fingers on your hand, starting from the little finger and moving to the thumb. The little finger should remind you that the population can shrink. If the population shrinks, then chance can take over. For example, if only 4 individuals survive an epidemic, then their genes will represent the new gene pool. The next finger is the ring finger. This finger should remind you of mating because a ring represents a couple. If individuals choose a mate based on their appearance or location, the frequency may change. If red-headed individuals only mate with red-headed individuals, they could eventually form a new population. If no one ever mates with red-headed individuals, these genes could decrease. The next finger is the middle finger. The M in the middle finger should remind you of the M in the word mutation. If a new gene is added through mutation, it can affect the frequency. Imagine a gene mutation creates a new color of hair. This would obviously change the frequency in the gene pool. The pointer finger should remind you of movement. If new individuals flow into an area or immigrate, the frequency will change. If individuals flow out of an area or emigrate, then the frequency will change. In science, we refer to this movement as gene flow. All four of the processes represented by our fingers can cause evolution: small population size, non-random mating, mutations, and gene flow. However, none of them lead to adaptation. Natural selection is the only process that creates organisms better adapted to their local environment. I use the thumb to remember this process. Nature votes thumbs up for adaptations that will do well in their environment and thumbs down to adaptations that will do poorly. The genes for individuals that are not adapted for their environment will gradually be replaced by those that are better adapted. Red hair is an example of one of these adaptations. Red hair is an advantage in the northern climates because the fair-skinned allowed ancestors to absorb more light and synthesize more vitamin D. Thumbs up. However, this was a disadvantage in the more southern climates where increased UV radiation led to cancer and decreased fertility. Thumbs down. Even the thumb itself is an adaptation formed through the process of natural selection. The evolution that we have described is referred to as microevolution because it refers to a small change. However, this form of evolution may eventually lead to macroevolution or speciation. Every organism on the planet shares ancestry with a single common ancestor. All living organisms on the planet are connected back in time through the process of evolution. Take a look at your own hand. It's an engineering masterpiece that was created by the 5 processes I just described over millions and millions of years. Can you recall the 5 main causes of evolution from memory? If you can't, hit rewind and watch that part again. But if you can, give yourself or your neighbor a big 5-fingered high five.
The 3 major factors that alter allele frequencies and bring about the most evolutionary change or the most rapid change are gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. Let's talk about each of these in turn. Gene flow describes the movement of alleles among populations, between populations. New traits can be transferred through the movement of fertile individuals or gametes. New people moving into the region, bringing with them new and exotic traits. Gene flow tends to reduce variation among populations over time, creating one very diverse, massive population, as opposed to distinct smaller populations. Another major driver is genetic drift. Genetic drift describes how allele frequencies will fluctuate unpredictably from one generation to the next, just because a heterozygous trait is 50% likely doesn't mean that it's going to show up 50% of the time every time. Genetic drift tends to reduce genetic variation through the loss of alleles over time. Phenomenons that can lead to this drifting of one version over the others can be the founder effect or bottleneck effects. Know the difference between these two. The founder effect describes a situation where a few individuals become isolated from the larger population, taking with them a subset of alleles. Not all trait types are represented equally there. A bottleneck event results in a similar reduction to allele variation, but this is because of a sudden population decrease, usually responding to some sort of massive environmental or natural disaster-like change. In either case, the resulting gene pool is no longer reflective of the original population's allelic frequencies. So in the diagram we have here is an example of a bottleneck effect. The diagram here shows a bottleneck effect and where the name comes from. We can see that the original population is about 45% blue, 45% white, and 10% yellow. But when this massive event occurs, only a few traits and individuals survive. They have squeezed through this bottleneck of chance And the surviving population here does not reflect the 45 blue, 45 white, 10% yellow. It is 90% blue and 10% white, no yellow at all. So genetic drift can ultimately change the alleles present because subsets reduce the variation. When genetic drift occurs, the allele frequencies change at random. These changes are most notable in small populations, and sometimes it can lead to the complete loss of a trait or phenotype. The worst case scenario here is that sometimes the mutated or harmful alleles are by chance what survives, and they become fixed as the new norm. The final major driver is natural selection. Natural selection describes the differential success in reproduction amongst individuals with certain traits, and therefore their alleles are more likely to be passed on to the next generation in greater proportion. Another way to think about this is nature is selecting who's best suited to thrive, survive, and procreate. Let's take a look at natural selection in a little more detail. In evolution, we describe survival of the fittest, but it's important to recognize that fit doesn't mean stronger, faster, smarter. Fit refers to an organism's ability to reproduce. Compared to the average, how much more likely are they to have offspring, and how much more likely are their offspring likely to survive? It's a ratio, not a raw number. So in this story here, we've got an overproduction of deer or caribou, and every species tends to produce more individuals than can survive to maturity. Along the way, some will die because they're eaten by predators, some will die of disease, some just aren't fit enough to survive. And the individuals that have good genes are more likely to survive. This is what selection is. Some individuals survive longer and reproduce more than others do. And so they are passing down those good genes. And this overall leads to adaptation, evolution, that those traits survive and become more common in the population. So evolution and natural selection are not the same thing. Natural selection is a process. Evolution and natural selection are not the same thing. Evolution is tracking changes over time, and natural selection is the event in which determines what traits survive in this moment. Both of these involve chance and sorting. Those new genetic variations arrive by chance, and then the environment sorts good versus bad based upon which individuals make it to adulthood and reproduce. Natural selection must occur before evolution can take place, but it will lead to adaptive evolution, a particular type of change that makes the organism better suited for the environment it's in. When natural selection is occurring, there are three modes or patterns that the selection can take shape in. Be able to recognize directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. When natural selection is occurring, there are three modes or patterns it can exhibit. Be able to recognize directional, disruptive, and stabilizing changes. In directional selection, one genotype, one extreme is favored above all else. In disruptive selection, both the extremes are favored, while the heterozygous form is suppressed. And in stabilizing selection, the intermediate heterozygous form is the most beneficial, and the two extremes are suppressed. Here we see the three patterns of selection depicted. In the first, we can see the original population as a solid red line, and we're seeing evidence of directional selection as that bell curve shifts towards darker and darker mice. In the second panel, we see disruptive selection, where the white and black extreme phenotype mice are depicted, but the brown tawny mice in the center dip down. And in the third scenario, we see stabilizing selection, where there's almost no white or black mice, but many, 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 many more brown mice. When selection occurs, ultimately we'll see changes in the frequency of alleles, with the good genes occurring more and more commonly. This can lead to adaptive where natural selection is taking place, we will see changes in the frequency of alleles, where those good traits will occur more commonly. And this will lead to the adaptive evolution of the organism, making the organism a better match to the environment it's in. This is a continuous process because the environment can change, and so adaptive evolution will move towards better fitting and then move back and to address the new change and then move back. It's not stagnant. Because it's a continuous process, we want to preserve variation overall. We don't want to lose old traits entirely, because should the environment change back, it's imperative that there be some old traits around to enable survival. We say a locus is fixed, a gene is fixed, if all individuals in the population have the same allele form. They're homozygous for the same allele, meaning there is no variation. And this can be problematic. It hinders evolution. And so nature has created a wide variety of mechanisms to ensure that there's always going to be some differences. Some mechanisms include diploidy, mom and dad's traits. We've got two chances of getting something new. Balancing selection, the heterozygote advantage, and something known as frequency-dependent selection, that sometimes things are selected for based upon how rare they are. There's a saying in psychology, exotic becomes erotic. We are attracted to things that we don't typically see, and that helps us to preserve rarer traits. Let's talk about each of these in turn. Diploidy. Heterozygotes have two copies of their genetic information, two different copies. And so they can carry recessive alleles that are hidden from the effects of selection. They are carrier, they are otherwise healthy. We do not see natural selection crossing them off, but it preserves a rare occurrence of that altered form. Balancing selection occurs when natural selection will maintain stable frequencies of two or more phenotypic forms. And this might be due to heterozygote advantage. There's some sort of compromise or unseen edge in maintaining a less than ideal trait, or frequency-dependent selection. And so we can see here stabilizing selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection depicted in comparison to balancing selection, this maintenance of all these different forms, saying any of these are okay. A good example of balancing selection is eye color. It doesn't matter if you've got blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes or black eyes. They're all balanced. They're all just various forms. No one actually has a better benefit. This occurs when the heterozygous form has a higher likelihood of surviving and reproducing than either the doubly good or the doubly bad circumstance. The classic example is sickle cell anemia, where the individual who is a carrier for sickle cell anemia has just enough oxygen for themselves to survive, but not enough oxygen for the parasite. So this form is maintained in areas where malaria is prolific, because individuals that are doubly healthy die of malaria, and individuals that are doubly sick with sickle cell anemia die of sickle cell anemia. But the heterozygote advantage is circumstantial to that environment. Take malaria out of the equation, and we would see the doubly healthy version being more commonplace than somebody who's a carrier of sickle cell disease. The second version is frequency-dependent selection. The fitness varies over time and declines if it becomes too common in the population. This is also known as a minority advantage. Predators are used to chasing prey that look a certain way. But if that prey becomes too rare, they need to branch out and find alternate forms. And so it becomes a matter of ease and efficiency. The story that we have here is crows that are flying in. They see that there's a lot of green beetles. So when they're eating beetles, they're more likely to just grab green beetles because that's more abundant and available. Over time, this will change the beetle population to be more red skewed than green skewed because more reds survive to reproduce. But crows still like beetles. And so as the population changes, their preferences will shift as well. And sooner or later, the crows will start eating more red beetles because they're more commonplace than trying to hunt down a coveted green. Nature's not the only one that decides who lives and dies and reproduces. Mates have choice as well. Sexual selection is where mates choose for reproductive success. And where sexual selection is strong, it can result in sexual dimorphism. This means marked differences between males and females of that type. Sexual preferences explain the occurrence of traits that have no actual survival advantage. So, comical depiction. A peacock with beautifully plumed feathers and tail would stand out, unable to camouflage, and be easier to catch, much easier prey, than a male peacock that looked like the brown and tawny and smaller peahen. And yet we see this beautiful plumage maintained generation after generation, and the female selecting for peacocks with even more beautiful and more extravagant tail feathers. They have a marked preference, a mating selection. We also see an interesting thing, a pattern. Where dimorphism exists, we see competitive and short-term mating strategies occur more frequently. Meaning that if male and females look markedly different, there's more competition between the genders, more competition among the genders, and the more promiscuous their partnering are. Meanwhile, where sexual dimorphism does not exist, when the males and females look almost identical, varying only slightly in size, their mating strategies tend to be more monogamous. They'll stay together as one mating pair for the entire season, or sometimes even life. There's less pressure, there's less temptation elsewhere. Some good examples of monogamous species are swans, voles, wolves, termites, worms, bald eagles. If you look at an animal and can't discern if it's male or female, chances are it has a monogamous mating strategy. But if you look at an animal and can distinctly tell the biological male versus the biological female, chances are it's competing to be the biggest, baddest, sexiest peacock on the block. That competition can take two forms: intrasexual or intersexual. Know the difference between these two. Intra means within, among individuals of one sex. Inter means between. This is competition between the genders. So intrasexual selection describes when males of one species compete to be the biggest, baddest male on the block and then have their pick of the litter. Whereas intersexual selection describes a situation where males showcase their skills and it is the female who's choosy and gets to pick their mate. In watching mating strategies and tracing generations over time, we've noticed a good genes hypothesis arise. The idea here is that if a trait is related to health, preference will align to that. So beautiful tail feathers may not have an advantage for surviving against a predator, but the vibrant colors of that tail indicates good eating, good hunting and gathering skills. And so female preferences lead towards the showier peacock feathers because it indicates this male can provide and is possibly faster or more cunning to avoid the disadvantage of being a neon flashing buffet line. There are no perfect organisms. In the history of the earth, not one organism has been created perfectly. Why do you think that is? It's because selection can only act on the existing variations. What's available right here and now. Evolution is limited by historical constraints. There might have been better genes way back in the day, but if a bottleneck event occurred or an asteroid hit and destroyed millions, taking that trait with it, it may or may not come back through random mutation. Oftentimes, these adaptations are compromises, like a heterozygote advantage. Not ideal, but it does solve the immediate problem at hand. And it's important to note that chance plays a big role in this. Just because you evolve the trait doesn't mean you're going to pass it on to every one of